Okay, MOvember, day 4. Just finished the men's group. Tonight, it's part 2 of boundaries, and it might even be a part 3 of boundaries, but anyway, I'm going to do setting internal boundaries. So this is from the book of Pia Mellody. It's from the 3rd section of the book on becoming a functional adult, and it's going to explain how to set an internal boundary. So I'm going to read and maybe explain things as I go. You need an internal boundary so you can detach enough to accurately hear what another person tells you about who he or she is, so you can separate that person's feelings and thoughts from your own. With a good internal boundary, you can be in a relationship without projecting your own skewed interpretations onto the other person or allowing that person's fear or pain, for instance, to become your own and overwhelm you. And an intact internal boundary is especially helpful and necessary when someone is confronting you. With a healthy internal boundary, you can truly detach from other people while staying in caring relationships. You can begin to choose your own behavior, thinking, and feeling reality rather than making a strong automatic responses that baffle you. Therefore, learning to set an internal boundary is a very big part of recovery from codependence or developmental trauma disorder. Learning to set a healthy internal boundary usually takes more time, practice, and patience than setting an external boundary because it's not something that you can touch or feel. So the purpose of these exercises are to help you learn to recognize when someone has authentically transgressed your internal boundary or when you have transgressed someone else's internal boundary, and to help you develop your own healthy internal boundary system. So before doing the following exercises, you can do, she suggests we look at our own step 1. Pia's also got in the book Facing Codependence, which I've got on my bookshelf, there's some reading there. But she then goes on to explain it a little bit in this book, and that's what I'm reading to you tonight. So when your developmental trauma or codependence is operating, you blame other people for your thoughts, feelings, and behavior, and blame yourself for other people's thoughts, feelings, and behavior. You have the idea that other people make you think, feel, or do things, or push your buttons. If you just wouldn't look at her that way, I wouldn't feel jealous. If you just come home at night when I want you to, I wouldn't be so upset and worried. If you'd be nicer to me, I wouldn't have to overeat and I could lose some weight. I can't tell her I'm angry about what she said about me because that would make her cry and ruin the weekend. This is erroneous, dysfunctional thinking. Nobody pushes your buttons, nobody makes you angry, and nobody can really hurt your feelings unless he or she is committing a genuine act of offense. When you observe something happening, that event first enters your mind as thoughts about the event and that give meaning to the event. And it is that meaning your mind gives an event that triggers your feeling reality, not the event itself. As a result of that self-generated feeling reality, you choose your behavior. So you are responsible for your own thinking, feeling, and what you do or don't do. The process works like this. So we experience an event. We'll give it a meaning, and I will put up tomorrow, when I do the internal reality, I'll do a model on this. I'll do a little drawing on this, but for the point of tonight, it's just that event comes in as data through our 5 senses. We will give it meaning through our experience, all of our core beliefs and everything we've ever learnt. And that meaning choice then leads to feelings, and those feelings then drive our behavior. Since the experience of abuse in your past leads to skewed thinking about present events, you may often come up with some distorted meanings for perfectly non-offensive events. As my husband has said to me more than once, Pia, you can take perfectly good data into your head, and by the time you finish giving it meaning, it has very little to do with reality. By the same token, you don't have the power to cause anybody else to think, feel, or do or not do anything. When you say or do something, the other person takes it in, gives it meaning, and has feelings and behaviors about it, all his or her own. This is why some people can stay calm and serene when being criticized, and other people dissolve into tears when someone doesn't smile at them. The skewed thinking process often begins in childhood when the parent blames the child for the abuse the parent is doing, and being abused creates other kinds of skewed thinking. Since thinking triggers feelings, skewed thinking makes it hard for codependents to know what they are really feeling or what is really happening in their relationships. I am convinced that to recover, a codependent must grasp this phenomenon of skewed thinking and how this is responsible for many of the codependent painful feelings and mistakes in behavioral responses. But becoming aware of this skewed thinking process is very difficult, since it is your mind, which thinks in a skewed way, that must learn to recognize the skewed process and how it is affecting your feelings. This factor makes recovery from codependence more complex. But the acceptance of the fact that your thinking is very likely to be skewed, it is not impossible. Another painful consequence of a lack of healthy internal boundaries is when someone is telling you his or her thoughts or opinions. You think you must agree with the person giving up your own thinking reality, or you must argue with the person until your opinion wins. This damages and bruises relationships a great deal. But these are not the only choices. A person with good internal boundaries does not have to convince others of the validity of his or her reality. It is important to acknowledge and accept the following as you begin to work on improving your internal boundaries. Thoughts. You have the right to think what you think. You only need to face the consequences of your thinking. Feelings. You have the right to whatever feelings you have. You just need to be careful that you don't offend someone else with your feelings by expressing them immoderately. Your feelings are based on your thinking, and you can't change them except by changing your thinking. And behavior. You have the right to do or not do whatever you need to for yourself. You have the right to determine what your behavior needs to be for yourself. You need only note the impact of your behavior on other people and be willing to face the consequences. If your behavior is authentically offensive to another person, you are responsible for the impact of it. To set your internal boundary, you must begin acting and thinking as if you do, in fact, have the right to think, feel, and do whatever you want to think, feel, and do. Hearing other people describe this process in 12-step meetings or watching sponsors or friends actually do it in their own lives can add much courage and motivation to begin living this way yourself. At the same time, you must be aware that while you have the right to think what you think, the way your thinking affects your emotional reality and your behavior bears examining. Your skewed thinking creates painful and sometimes unnecessary codependent feeling reality. You need strong internal boundaries within which to examine your thinking, get more information, and correct any thinking you find to be skewed. Healthy thinking in recovery can relieve some of the most painful emotional reactions you have been subject to when operating in your codependence. So making your internal boundary work, keep in mind that when you first start to consciously set an internal boundary, it will probably feel very strange and you may not be very successful at it. I've noticed that most codependents have to attempt the process many times before it works for them. But keep working with this anyway, because the first time it works for you, I believe you will be amazed at how wonderful you feel. The following exercises help me and others to learn how to make the internal boundary work. Whenever someone confronts you by telling you his or her thinking and feeling reality about you, use the following steps to set your internal boundary. Imagine your external boundary in the form. So first thing is imagine the external, which is on the other boundary, the other video. Imagine your external boundary in a form such as an inverted jar over you or an energy force surrounding you that you can see in your mind. 2. Hold your earlobe between your thumb and forefinger and incline your head slightly towards the person to whom you're listening to remind yourself that the functional thing to do at this moment is to listen, not to defend yourself. I started doing this because whenever my husband confronted me, I used to have a shame attack or a rage attack instantly, and I didn't hear a thing he said. 3. Imagine your internal boundary in the form of a bulletproof vest or a hard metal plate under your skin or on your chest. The image I use for my internal boundary has little doors in it that I open from the inside. Only I control when they open. They cannot be opened from the outside. Silently repeat to yourself this memorized statement about the other person. What you think, feel, and choose to do or not do at this moment is more about you and your history than it is about what I have said or done, and vice versa, unless I have committed an authentic act of offense. And then 5 is to listen to hear if the information coming in to you is true, not true, or questionable, and then take appropriate action. So there's some more reading here about this and the process in action, and there's some information here around that and some images in this book that give it a nice little graphic. So I might hold that still for a second so it gets it on what it would look like when you're trying to protect yourself from someone else's reality. So I will just read the process in action. Harry comes into the kitchen and says to his wife Anne, "I need to tell you that I'm angry with you." Right then she knows a confrontation is happening. He's going to express his thinking and feeling reality to her, and Anne must set her internal boundaries so she can hear what Harry has to say and be intimate and appropriate. First, Anne imagines her external boundary and imagines setting it down over her whole body. Next, she reminds herself that she is to be listening to Harry, not defending herself. She might even hold or touch her earlobe as a reminder. Then Anne sets her internal boundary by imagining a sheet of metal under her skin and on her chest, doors facing in. She says to herself, what Harry thinks and feels and chooses to do or not do at this moment is more about Harry's history than it is about what I have said or done, unless I've authentically offended him. That helps Anne to be able to hear Harry and then note the impact of her behaviour on him. As she notes the impact of her behaviour on him, she must remember that the impact is still more about him than it is about her, unless she has transgressed one of Harry's boundaries. If Harry is experiencing Anne's reality and not liking it, his sensibilities may feel offended, but I'm not using the term offended in this way. Anne listens to what Harry says, using her internal boundary. She reminds herself, I have the right to determine whether Harry is saying what Harry is saying about me is true, not true, or questionable. And after he is finished, she determines for herself which of the three it is. If it's true, it did happen, and as he's describing it. Not true, it did not happen as he's describing it, and questionable, and isn't sure whether it happened or not. If she decides the information is true, even if it is threatening to her self-concept, she then imagines it is a little piece of matter out in front of her. She lets it come through the external boundary and the door in the internal boundary and has a feeling about it. It may feel painful or wonderful, depending on what Harry is confronting her about. Let's say, for example, Anne forgot to pick Harry up at work and she'd promised to do so. And as a result, he missed his golf game with his boss. She realizes it is true, lets the information in through her external and internal boundaries, feels the guilt, and decides how she will make amends. This is what I mean when I say that to recover, you must hug your demons or they'll bite you in the ass. Letting the truth come through the external and internal boundaries and acknowledging it as hugging your demons is a mature act and is also what I mean by being accountable. After Anne owns her feelings about the true material from Harry, she can take any appropriate action she may wish to about what he has told her. She can thank him, make amends, or do what she considers to be mature for her and about the information Harry has shared. If Anne listens and decides the information is not true, she imagines that the little lump of information hits the external boundary and bounces to the floor. She acknowledges to Harry that she has heard him, and by some means such as nodding her head, she may even express her feelings about the fact that Harry is having a painful experience by saying something like, "That sounds painful." But it is not necessary for her to take responsibility for what he or she is feeling, thinking, or doing, or not doing, or what Harry is feeling, thinking, doing, or not doing. In fact, excuse me, in fact, it is an act of maturity not to take responsibility for something when she has not committed any authentically offensive act. A mature person is able to tolerate the fact that somebody has a different sense of reality about what happened and doesn't have to argue, justify himself or herself, or prevail. With maturity, Anne can let Harry or anyone else have whatever his reality is. Remember that much of Harry's reality is related to his own history, and only if Anne has authentically offended him is it helpful for her to let that confrontative information inside her boundaries and to have feelings about it. For most codependents who set out to develop an internal boundary system, most information falls in the questionable category. So, if you find that you are often in doubt about the truth of a confrontative claim, don't think there is something strange about you. This is very common. With practice and recovery, you will recognize more easily what is true about yourself and what isn't. But there is a way to deal with questionable confrontive material. If Anne decides Harry's confrontative information is questionable, she lets that little piece of information go through her external boundary, brings it around behind her and puts it on her shoulder where she can watch it. But she allows nothing to enter her internal boundary. Eventually, when she gets enough data about the information Harry has given her, Anne will very likely have a definite sense of whether the statement is either true or not true. If information turns out to be not true, then she throws it outside her external boundary. If she realizes it is true, she lets it in through the door of her internal boundary and has her feelings about it. That too takes maturity. This later scenario of handling questionable information is the experience most people have in treatment when their families confront them. What about disputing untrue statements? Many people ask me, if the confrontive material is not true, can I dispute what the person is confronting me with? I recommend not to argue or dispute untrue statements at first, but to practice the process as I've described it. By practicing keeping your mouth shut, you gradually become more comfortable when other people disagree with you and don't have the same sense about you that you have. This allows the other person to be who he or she is and teaches you to accept that fact that not everyone sees you the way you do. And this way of handling confrontative situations is much more serene for those codependents who have always hated confrontations. This process may be difficult to practice at first because a real issue for many codependents is control. We want to make sure that everybody believes what we believe, and that's what's happening is in accordance with what we believe. But this is an impossible stance, since all people will never have the same perceptions about us or anything else that we do. Insisting that others agree with our perceptions destroys or bruises relationships. Learning to communicate by practicing this exercise can allow you to live in a mature action for yourself rather than in constant codependent reaction to other people. If you're on Harry's end of the experience and are confronting someone, understand that you have the right to confront anybody with your reality and need only face the consequences of doing so. But before you confront someone with your reality, it is helpful to remind yourself that your reality is more about you than the person you're confronting, unless that person has authentically offended you. You may find as time goes on that more and more frequently you check your own thinking that sets up your confrontative feelings and discover that the offense you attributed to the other person is about your interpretation. If you check that out with another person, you may have a much more successful time communicating intimately and finding the truth about what really happened. So, two important caveats. Two extremely important caveats must be considered along with the information about a functional internal boundary. The first one is, although you know that you are not responsible for how someone else is responding to you, if you're in a relationship, you are responsible for noting the impact of your behavior on the other person. When you note the impact, you may feel some pain at seeing the person you care for in pain, even though your behavior has not been authentically offensive. But with healthy internal boundaries, you do not feel guilt and shame or feel responsible for causing the pain. Noting the impact of your behavior on others is extremely important to having healthy relationships. If you are not noting the impact of your behavior on the other person, you can't adjust your reality in the interest of making a relationship more comfortable. The attitude of tough, your pain is your problem, I don't care, will not lead to recovery and the growth of intimacy. For example, say I move something that belongs to my husband that I know that I have a right to move. My husband reacts to the fact that I've moved it. I know that when my boundary is standing up well, that his reaction to whatever I've done is more about him and his history than what I have said or done, as long as I haven't offended him. But I am in a relationship with him and I love and care about him. It's important to note the impact of my behavior because I may want to adjust some of it so we can live together more comfortably, even though I know his reaction to my behavior is about his history, not because I'm being offensive in any way. With my internal boundary working, I don't have feelings of shame and guilt about offending him, but I do learn about him and his feelings about this issue in question, and perhaps if the issue is serious enough for him, feels some pain about seeing my loved one in pain. Then I can decide whether I want to adjust my behavior to make our relationship more comfortable. As long as I do not have to adjust so much that I lose touch with myself and cannot express my own reality comfortably, such adjustments are fine. The other caveat is, if one person in an exchange has authentically offended the other person by pushing through his or her boundary system and has physically, sexually, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually attacked the other person, then the offender cannot truly say that the victim's reaction is about the victim's history. This statement does not hold in the victim-offender situation. For example, let's say one person has touched another person without permission, or has screamed at or ridiculed the other person's intellectual ability, all of which are authentic offensive acts. In this instance, the person who did the offensive act is liable for the effect on the other person. In other words, I can't slap my husband in anger for any reason and then, when he responds with a lot of anger and pain, say to him that's more about your history than about my slapping you across the face. That is not the case. So in this book, it goes on and then has some exercises you do to start practicing this. So I hope tonight this information has been helpful. I found learning about boundaries was just critical. I grew up in a family where you were blamed. I had a mentally ill mother, and you were just simply blamed. If she was feeling bad, it was your fault, you know. And I think my mother even had a saying, "Why should anyone feel good if I feel bad?" She was unwell, right? So it really helped me to learn about differentiation and setting an internal boundary, having an external boundary, learning about, you know, only I can determine what's true and not true for me, same goes for you. Learning about if something's true, I need to take it in, have a feeling about it. If it's not true, I need to leave it outside my boundaries. If it's questionable, I need more information. And like Pia said, early on with so much skewed thinking, I really need to know more information, a lot. And then also getting reality checks from others about this to help us know what our reality is a really important part of recovery. So anyway, this is MOvember Day 4, internal boundaries. It is difficult. As she says, you know, sometimes acting in your own best interest feels awful and shameful, as though you're doing something wrong for some time. But eventually, once you get it, you can really breathe, and life becomes a lot easier when you can learn to set boundaries. So be gentle with your heart, and I look forward to making another video tomorrow on reality, the third area of functional adultism. And with that, I'll see you then.